and welcome to Doubts Welcome, a ministry dedicated to answering your doubts, questions, and concerns about the Bible, God, and Christianity. Last time we talked about the prologue to the Gospel according to John, that is, John chapter 1, verses 1 to 18, and we looked at what we could get theologically from the text as a whole. Now, I would suggest watching that video, but you don't necessarily need to do so before this one. In this one, we're going to focus in on John chapter 1, verses 1 to 3, as you can see here on the screen, and in the following videos, we will do likewise with the other verses, going 2 to 3 verses at a time depending on how much information is in there. Here, we'll be starting our talk on what the Word was, who the Word was before the Incarnation. So let's get into the text. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were created through him, and apart from him not one thing was created that has been created. So focusing in on verse 1, we can split it up into 3 parts, A, B, and C, and this is something pretty standard when people are digging into the text. They will tend to refer to the verses in parts. Normally A and B, sometimes C. It doesn't normally go beyond C, though. Matter of fact, I can't think of any verse that does. But it's helpful, especially when a verse number starts actually in the middle of a sentence or has more than one sentence in it. Here we just have 3 clauses that it's easy to separate out and talk about. So focusing in on clause 1 here, or clause A, I should say, in the beginning was the Word. We want to focus on in the beginning. In the Greek, it's NRK. And this is how Genesis 1:1 starts in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, also called the Septuagint, or LXX for short. What John is doing here, and also later on in his prologue, is hearkening back to Genesis. And he's doing it for a very important reason, which we'll be talking about here in just a minute, because the next few words also tell us something about the Word. But for here, he's saying that as far back as you want to push time, the Word was already there. The Word never came into being. The Word has always been. There's never been a time where the Word was not. But that's not all that the Word is. So let's look at the next part of the verse here. And the Word was with God, and we're going to focus on with God. This here tells us that somehow the Word is distinct from God. This is just a small part of the argument for the doctrine of the Trinity, which is a doctrine that I know some Christians out there disagree with. I'm planning on doing a series of videos on the Trinity, taking a look, a pretty deep look at each aspect of the Trinity. So it's going to be, I would say, at least 4 or 5 videos long, just because I'm trying to keep the videos short. But essentially, what the Trinity teaches is that God is 1 in being and 3 in person. Here, we have 2 different persons, right? We have the Word and we have God. They're distinct somehow. In the next verse, what we have is the Word was God. And that's what we're going to focus on here. This distinction of the Trinity and the different persons, but there only being one God, is something that will come up again and again in our series, not just here, but on all the books of the Bible. I mean, it permeates the Bible. Not every single video is going to touch on it, but where it does, I will make sure to key you in to what that specific verse has to say about the Trinity, or how we can see that it supports the Trinitarian doctrine. Here, the Word was God. In Greek, the word order is a little different, but that doesn't matter as much because whereas English is dependent on the word order to some degree, Greek really isn't. It's because of the different case endings that Greek word order isn't really important when trying to understand it. However, the word order can tell us something about what's going on. So I'm going to show you the original word order, and that is, and God was the Word. With God being first, that means it's getting the emphasis of the clause. And I heard somebody, I forget who, but they suggested that this is telling us about the nature of the Word, and that makes sense. And what it's saying, they said divine, I'm changing it up a little bit. I would say that it's saying the Word was deity, and I emphasize deity as opposed to divine because there is, according to the Bible, only one true deity, only one true God. While others are called gods, they aren't really gods, and it's also not divine because, in a sense, angels are divine, but they're not deity, they're not God. And this will be backed up in verse 3 as well as verses 4 and 5, which we'll look at in the next video. And again, there are many other places within the Bible, as we're doing our entire Bible series, that will point to the Word, aka Jesus, if you remember from our last video, being God, and not just a God either. Something important that I want to point out is that there is no article here before God in this sentence in the Greek. There are those who will say that because there is no article, it can be translated as a god. The problem with that is there's only one kind of article in the Greek. That is the definite article, or what we would use as the. And they will put the article in front of proper names, which we don't do in English. They will use the article in other ways that we wouldn't use in English. And so you can't make a solid argument for stating that the word was a god. And so while if you look at this verse by itself and you isolate it from the entire rest of the Bible, you could possibly make an argument for that. When you look at the theology that the Bible teaches, you can't make that argument because the Bible teaches only one God as God is God. And that's what John here is saying, especially once we see verses 3 and 4 and 5, but especially verse 3. Now, verse 2 is really just reiterating what verse 1a and b have said. So he was with God in the beginning. So we have in the beginning and with God. So there's really not a whole lot more to say on this particular part of the verse. What about verse 3? All things were created through him, and apart from him not one thing was created that has been created. Here again we have two parts, A and B. So we're going to focus in on part A right now. We have, and all things were created through him. Now the word created here literally means came into being. So all things came into being through him. I want to focus on all things here because some groups will claim that God made Jesus and then Jesus made everything else. But the problem is the all things here. There is a Greek word for other things, but that's not used here. It's used in other places in the New Testament when referring to something other than this, but it's not here. So this has to be all things. And then also we have part B here, which says, apart from him not one thing was created that has been created. Or, apart from him, not one thing has come into being that did come into being, or came into being. So I have a little bit of a visual here that will make more sense of this. If you happen to be driving and listening to this, hopefully you're just listening, not watching the video, you may want to watch this again later when you're not driving. So let's take a look at this. Now, I got this from Greg Kokel, whose ministry is Stand to Reason. And I would suggest watching their videos. I think they do a really good job answering a lot of questions. And there are other apologists too that I would recommend. I'm going to leave that right now for here. So what we have, and this is, again, I got all this from Greg Kokel, we have two categories of things. We have uncreated things, and we have created things. Now we have Jesus up here for a second. The only uncreated thing that we know of is God. Then for the created things, well, there's everything else. The question we're asking here then, based off of this verse, is which category do we put Jesus in? Well, if we put Jesus over here in the created things category, then he's just like everything else, and he is a created thing and is therefore not God. However, the text says that nothing was created by anything other than the Word, which is Jesus, as we know from the previous video. Therefore, Jesus doesn't belong in the created things category, but he belongs in the uncreated things category. And of course, if Jesus is uncreated, then Jesus is God, because there is no other uncreated thing. The rest of the Bible is very, very clear that there's only one God, one deity, no other deity out there. There are other things that are called gods. There are times where humans who have a certain level of authority are referred to as a god, but they are not God like God is God. They cannot create things, they are not eternal, and they do not hold any of the various other attributes that I'm hoping to do a video series on, such as omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, and so on and so forth. Now, this is just one example of Jesus being God, not a God. And as we're doing our entire Bible series, I will be, again, showing you those verses that point to a Trinitarian viewpoint. But for now, we're going to leave that here. Next video, we'll be talking about John 1, verses 4 and 5. So if you liked the video, please give me a thumbs up. Leave me a comment. Let me know what I can do differently or to be more helpful. Feel free to ask questions, but you're better off emailing me your questions so that I can see them more quickly and do a video on them. If you think this would be useful for your family or friends, please share it with them. And please don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell notification icon so you'll know when I post the next video. And remember, bring on the doubts because you're always welcome.